I am Alessandra, and I'm really happy that you all came out, even though it's super hot out, so thank you very much. I hope it's worth it for you. Okay, so the image on this slide is in many ways very typical of what we've come to think of when we think about Palestinian landscape painting as a genre. In the foreground, an elderly Palestinian looks to the viewer. Yes? Are we good? Too loud? All right. I'm American, you know, I have a tendency to be too loud all the time, so. In the foreground, an elderly Palestinian looks to the viewer. His stance comfortable and confident, although he leans on a cane for support. Shaded by his kufiya, his face wears an opaque expression, a smile that's somehow jovial, proud, and somber all at once. Dressed in earth tones, he seems almost knit into the olive grove behind him, as though he himself is a part of this vast, terraced hill of gold and green. It's an image of resilience, of sumud. Here is a man who has held, oh my goodness, suddenly it got very loud. All right. Here is a man who has held on, despite the indignities of the Israeli occupation. And, oh, hello everyone. I'll just wait for you guys to get settled. Okay. Sure. Better? Okay. How am I on sound? We're good now? Everyone's all set? Okie dokie. Okay. So, anyway. As I was saying, the image we have here is an image of resilience. It's an image of a man who's held on to his land despite the indignities of the Israeli occupation, and who belongs to the land of Palestine as much as the Palestinian soil belongs to him. This is only a detail of the larger painting, however. When we zoom out, we see why the artist, Slimane Mansour, has titled this bittersweet canvas Memory of Places. The man doesn't stand in his olive grove, but instead he stands in front of a landscape painting in a museum or a gallery. Surrounded by the anonymous white walls of the exhibition space, the man could be anywhere. And indeed, the act of reminiscing implied by the title suggests that the painting here represents a place to which he cannot return, something that is sort of standing in for the place itself. This could be, of course, Palestine writ large, or perhaps the Palestine of his youth, as his advanced age suggests that he probably remembers the homeland before the era of Zionist colonialism. So in either case, it's clear that he can wander the orchards that he remembers only in his mind through this image. The painting before which the Palestinian man stands recalls scores of canvases created between the 1960s and the present day, including, like we see here, many paintings by Mansour himself. The natural beauty of Palestine has been a key inspiration for modern visual artists since the turn of the 20th century, and the olive tree in particular has gained specific relevance since 1967. In the wake of the Nakba, or the Six-Day War, the defeat, Palestinians articulated the strategy of sumud, or steadfastness, as a crucial element of resistance, stressing the primary importance of holding on to the land at all costs. With this strategic and ideological emphasis, agriculture gained prominence in artistic depiction of Palestine, as the Fellaheen came to represent the centuries-old connection between the land and its people. The olive tree itself became the primary symbol of sumud, or one of many symbols, but one of the primary ones, representing the rootedness of the Palestinians and the organic and indigenous nature of their claim to Palestine. In this painting, though, Mansour gives us a very different kind of sumud, one that unfortunately reflects the reality for too many people, too many Palestinians who cannot return to their land. There's an important steadfastness, this painting seems to suggest, inherent in keeping the memory of the land alive, even when the land itself has been usurped by the occupier. Art here is a vehicle through which Palestinians may still hold on to that which has been taken away. It's also a place of comfort, where rolling hills of fertile crops are not cut violently by red-roofed settlements or destroyed in acts of collective punishment. A painting, in other words, might provide a momentary escape from the drastic changes Israel has wrought upon the Palestinian environment. So I'm starting with this image today because it points to the broader significance and complexity of landscape painting in the Palestinian contexts. So the painting within this painting, the painting of the olive trees, can be seen to serve multiple different roles at once, and roles that are very typical of landscape painting in this context. So for the man who stands before this painting, it might conjure memories of happier times, as well as of painful loss. It might engender sorrow, but it might also, inspire hope that the serene natural landscape that you see in this painting might one day be restored. Insofar as it commemorates an inaccessible place, it's an object of both mourning and celebration, and may even provoke anger and action as, a call to arms in defense of the Palestinian homeland. Moreover, its specificity is not known to the viewer. It could be a snapshot of a particular place, known to the man in the picture, the painter of the landscape, or both. It could also be a fabricated, idealized image, meant to represent Palestine in synecdoche. So, the layered and sometimes contradictory signifiers that one might attach to these landscapes, or the landscape that I just talked about, are really present in all artistic representations of the Palestinian landscape, which explains why this topic has recently become a topic of interest for art historians and for curators, and for other scholars and artists. So Kemal Boulata and Tina Sherwell, Sami Halabi have all written about this, and most recently Sherwell curated an exhibition at the Palestinian Museum in Birzeit, which is called Intimate Terrains, Representations of a Disappearing Landscape. And that's currently on, and it treats a lot of the themes that crop up in the discussion of this topic. So it, thinks about negotiations of collective and personal memory, alienation and exile, artistic engagement with identity as it relates to land. As you can see here, just from these three landscapes that have been taken from this show, we're talking about a really broad, corpus of representation here. We're not talking about one particular individual sort of style. We're talking about many styles and many topics over, now close to 100 years. So today, I'm going to present a modest contribution to this conversation that focuses only on a very narrow sliver of a much wider history, asking how artists in the 1970s mobilized landscapes to grapple with, or even to refuse to acknowledge, the rapidly changing political realities on the ground in Palestine. So I'm going to start with some things that might be termed more traditional landscapes that were created by Palestinians both within Palestine and in exile during the 1970s, and in some cases the early 1980s. These images that I'm terming more traditional are images that represent the land literally in depictions of urban and natural environments, but also allegorically, so as personified by the Palestinian woman. Usually this allegory is a falaha, mother, or a virgin. In the wake of 1967, these kinds of pictures served to honor and to celebrate the ethos of Samud, but importantly, they also served to conjure this sort of once and future Palestine, this mythologized Palestinian past that could also, hopefully serve as a model for the future. So, as I'll explain, I mean conjuring in the magical sense of the word. These landscapes really called Palestine forth almost as in a spell, willing a safe, harmonious, and homogeneous Palestine into existence through these idealized images of the lost homeland. So, once I'm done, looking at these kinds of images, I will move on to some very different images. So these are the two works on paper that I'll be focusing my discussion on today. So one is an untitled 1970 print from Mustafa Hallaj, and the other one is a mixed media print or mixed media drawing by Samira Badran entitled 25 Barrels from 1977. So, and my argument here is that these landscapes constitute, or these images constitute another mode of landscape representation that isn't literal and it's not allegorical, but rather it's phantasmagorical. So, although they operate through this visual vocabulary of fantasy, these images, I'm going to argue, hopefully you'll agree with me, engage the material reality of Palestinian land in a way that more traditional landscapes don't. So, starting with Jamal al-Husseini, this is an artist who rose to prominence in the 1960s and 1970s for her evocative, serene cityscapes, many of which depicted Jerusalem, which obviously is the symbolic heart of Palestine, but it was also Husseini's home. So, displaced during the Nakba in 1947, Husseini settled in Beirut, where she remained until the Israeli invasion of 1982. So her paintings of Palestine, significantly, were not done in Palestine from life, but were rather done from memory in Beirut. This painting is emblematic of her style during this period, and you can see that what we have is a heavily stylized Jerusalem with vast, all of its monuments sort of crowded together. You can see the Holy Sepulchre, you can see the Haram al-Sharif, behind the wall of the old city. So here, Hosseini's restricted color palette gives the painting a kind of dreamlike feel, calm, almost reverent in these whites and pale blues. For me, it kind of evokes a stillness, kind of like falling snow. And definitely adding to this feeling of calm is the total absence of people from this composition. So there are no signs of life here, which, to anyone who has ever been to Jerusalem seems strange, right? The hustle and bustle that is normally present is gone. But even though this absence is here and is palpable, the image isn't totally melancholy. It's, there's a sort of balance of joy and sadness in it. The use of gold gives this composition kind of a warm glow. The buildings look sort of lit from within in a way that is both ethereal and quite earthly, as if we've come to town on a cold day and we see windows twinkling as people gather inside. So, set into this scene is an excerpt from a poem by renowned Palestinian author Samih al-Qasim, excuse me. The text, roughly translated, reads, "You're with me in my heart and my eyes and my voice, with me from the first tremor of birth to the last tremor of death." By incorporating this poem into the landscape of the city, the painting seems to identify itself as a means not only of remembering Jerusalem, but of asserting its continuous presence, its inextricability from the very body of the Palestinian. In so doing, it calls to mind Slimane Mansour's celebrated 1973 painting, also pictured here, which is called The Camel of Heavy Burdens, or The Carrier of Heavy Burdens, and features a peasant man bearing the whole of Jerusalem on his back. So, as in Hosseini's painting, the Palestinian landscape here it seems portable somehow, right? It's something that the Palestinian carries from place to place, even in exile. So, moving from the city to the country, Ibrahim Ghanam's depiction of harvest scenes also speak to the place of the land and its memory in contemporaneous Palestinian artistic practice. So, like Hosseini, Ghanam painted these scenes from Beirut, but the fertile farmlands that we see here in these, lustrous commemorative works could not have been further from his experience. in Lebanon. So the artist contracted polio, unfortunately, shortly after his family fled from the area of Haifa to the Tel al-Zatar refugee camp in the area of Beirut. And he lived there in the refugee camp, confined to a wheelchair for basically the rest of his life. So Kamal Bulata has suggested that painting as a practice was a means of escape for Ghanam into memory. He lived in a cramped room overlooking open sewers, but he painted sprawling, bucolic scenes of rural life. He was celebrating this kind of fertile abundance while he was forced to ration his own food and water. The contrast between his life and these paintings is quite significant. But Ghanam's paintings are composed with self-aware naivete, their simplicity lending them an aura of sincerity and optimism. Both compositions are dominated by the cheerful yellow gold of the wheat field, contrasting with the verdant hills and ivory buildings of the distant landscape. The fellahin who work the harvest also stand out against the warm ochre background, dressed in red, white, black, and green, the colors of the Palestinian flag. The clothing of these workers is especially significant in the context of the time. At this time, it was sort of obviously it was not the beginning nor the end, but it was a high point at which cultural heritage was, a point of contention between Israelis who were appropriating it as a means of legitimizing themselves and Palestinians. So for Palestinians, there was a renewed emphasis on this cultural heritage. So especially in arts and crafts, such as tetris, the traditional embroidery, for which Palestinian women have been renowned, became an important symbol of national pride. So these sort of traditional modes of dressing and traditional modes of craftsmanship were especially prized during this period. Anyway, these paintings suggest the maternal plenitude of rural Palestine. This wheat is abundant and richly colored. The orchards and the olive groves are lush and life-sustaining. The fellahin, moreover, are as much a part of the landscape as the physical land itself, painted not as narrative characters, but as organic parts of larger compositions. This points to a larger trend of the period, in which the rural Palestinian peasant farmer was figured as a national signifier, symbol of Palestine as both a unified community and as a physical place. The felah or felaha ceased to represent a particular stratum of society, but instead came to mean Palestinianness itself. This iconography centered farmers in order to emphasize the direct and natural connection of all Palestinians to the land, which was, of course, especially potent in the wake of the Naksa's devastating losses. So, here, like Ghanam, Ismail Shamut, and Sima Mansour again, give us visions of an abundant Palestine. But rather than showing them simply through the plentiful harvests, they're also showing them through the villagers themselves. So again, note the emphasis on traditional dress, especially the attention that Mansour pays to the embroidery on the front of the villagers, or the villagers' dress rather. That these people, these allegories, are women is not coincidental. So as Tina Sherwell has pointed out, Palestine has most often been allegorized as female, with the land represented as simultaneously maternal and virginal. So the paradoxical equation of the Palestinian landscape with motherhood and virginity imbues it with both agency and vulnerability. So on the one hand, like a mother, it nourishes and shelters and sustains its people, but on the other, its purity, its virginal purity, requires protection, as it's constantly under the threat of defilement or contamination at the hands of the occupier. So the paintings that I've shown so far are all part of a rich tradition of literal and allegorical Palestinian landscape images. Though Hosseini Ghanem, Mansour, and Shamut each approached the topic of the land in varied styles and from different geographical and social positions. Mansour was working in Palestine, the rest were in Beirut. Hosseini had wealth and relative mobility, whereas Ghanem, as I mentioned, was effectively confined to a refugee camp. These works all share several important characteristics. Firstly, they are all basically straightforward, legible, realistic depictions of Palestine. Secondly, even though they are realistic, they are idealized images. They draw from a mythologized past in order to envision an alternate future for Palestine. Hosseini's peaceful city, Ghanam's bountiful fields, and the allegorical compositions of Shamut and Mansour bear no trace of the devastation wrought upon the landscape by Israeli aggression. Instead, they present the promise of a homogeneous Palestine, populated only by its indigenous Palestinians. Although formally realistic, these works are almost magical in their seeming will to conjure this once and future Palestine, a pre-1948 paradise that could one day be reconstituted as a nation state. By conjuring, I mean a certain kind of calling forth that requires a degree of magical thinking. Rather than simply prompting nostalgia, these images emerged and circulated in a nationalist discourse as visions of a possible future inspired by a past, and a past that was heavily romanticized. So, as such, they willfully and powerfully ignore the obtrusive presence of Zionists in Palestine, forcefully constructing a world that they wish to manifest. So, the majority of literal and allegorical landscape paintings of this era eschew direct engagement with the material realities of the occupation. Where then are these realities taken up? One place, I will argue, is in images that I term phantasmagorical landscapes. So in contrast to the clear, realistic scenes of buildings and fields and people that we've seen so far, these landscapes are full of surreal and fantastic imagery, right? They don't look real. They don't look like someone is painting from out a window. They're teeming instead with these monstrous hybrid creatures, disorienting perspectives, and impossible proportions. So during the rest of this talk, I will explore the ways in which these chaotic aesthetic vocabularies actually work in conversation with the visual strategies that we've already seen in order to grapple with the catastrophic physical changes wrought upon Palestine by Israeli aggression. So to do this, as you know from the title of this talk, I will be dealing with these two works. This untitled print by Mustafa Hallaj, which fuses human, animal, and vegetal forms with each other, therefore creating a landscape that through simultaneous engagement with the concrete and the mythological addresses the grim reality of Israeli expansion and the human cost of resisting it. Samira Badran's 25 Barrels evokes cartography in order to carve a landscape from a dense fabric of hybrid forms, transgressing the boundaries between the mechanical and the organic to create a world in which machines and everyday materials seem to take on lives of their own. This imaginative work, in its plays on perspective and containment, reflects on the material restrictions that were forced and continue to be forced on Palestinians by the changing geography of the occupation. So, Mustafa Hallaj came from a humble background. His father was a migrant farm worker, and some of his earliest memories were of traveling with him from orchard to orchard throughout the fertile agricultural regions of Palestine. When he was 9, Hallaj and his family fled Zionist violence on foot and ultimately wound up settling in Egypt, where he completed all of his training. And even though he spent most of his adult life outside of Egypt, this adopted homeland had a major impact on his work and on his identity. He used to joke that he was more Egyptian than most Egyptians, and he thought of the clay of the Nile as his first, artistic medium, having played with it as a child. So his affinity for Egypt didn't preclude his pride as a Palestinian, though. As I'm sure many of you know, he was an active participant in the cultural wings of the PLO in Beirut and Damascus, and a lot of his best known work engages with the struggle for Palestinian self-sovereignty. And he produced posters and things like this as well. So he himself believed that it was the duty of the Palestinian artist to use his or her art to combat the self-denial, these are his words, and suffocation of historical heritage that the Israeli occupation imposes upon Palestinians. So this print is very much typical of this lifelong aesthetic. This is, he has a very consistent visual vocabulary from the early 1960s until his death in the early 2000s. So it's suspended somewhere between the realms of reality, mythology, and nightmare. And in the foreground, we see a funeral procession in which a long line of humans, animals, and hybrid creatures carry a stretcher across the length of the composition. At the front of the stretcher is a rooster, crowned with a calligraphic depiction of the word Palestine. This is a recurring motif in Hallaj's work from this period. Behind him lies the body of a human, a martyr, who sprouts trees from his chest, arms, genitals, and thighs, while his shins serve as a perch for a flock of birds. It's notable that 4 of these birds are the only creatures in the procession that look backward rather than forward, turning away from the head of the martyr and looking towards the mourners who follow behind. 3 of these mourners appear to be women, but the 2 behind them are more ambiguous, both hominid figures. One appears to have the head of a sheep, while the other has a skull that seems to morph into a vulture. The subtle slopes and exaggerated size of the corpse mirror the hill in the background, which, combined by the trees, insinuates the body into the landscape itself. The rest of this print is no less complex. In the middle ground, hills ripple beneath a horse, a chicken, and a woman, all of whom are giving birth, or, in the case of a chicken, laying an egg. The woman's legs are spread, her ankles bound with ropes and pulled to either side by male figures as her infant emerges. A tree grows from one knee. We cannot see her face, but above her bulging belly and her breasts looms a skeletal figure who appears to bear down on her, shoulders tensed with the effort. This figure, which could, represent death, it could represent the occupation, seems to be smothering the mother as she delivers her child. In the far background is yet another plain of hills, one that seems vaguely to echo the corpse in the foreground. In the upper right-hand corner, an enormous crow picks at the hilltop, which almost resembles the stomach of a man. To its left, the head of a huge chicken emerges from behind the hill, the only figure in the composition with a discernible eye, which is, of course, trained on the viewer. As is typical of Hallaj's work, the print bears obvious traces of the artist's interest in the mythologies of various ancient Near Eastern cultures. The figures in the foreground, for example, evoke the stylistic norms of ancient Egypt, depicted with elongated, flattened bodies. The scale of the figures also seems in keeping with these norms. So in ancient Egypt, people often represented people according to a hierarchy of proportion, by which more important individuals were bigger than less important individuals. So in evoking this, with this huge corpse and these tiny people carrying it, Hallaj may or may not be suggesting the significance of the deceased relative to the living who carry his body. So the presence of the rooster also recalls mythological references. The rooster is associated with Mesopotamian gods of war, the underworld, light, and fire. So as a standard bearer for Palestine, the rooster can be seen at once to represent the dawn of a new day and the promise of a brighter future, but it can also be seen to represent the darker certainties of death and bloodshed. So Hallaj does not limit his engagement with mythology to the ancient world. He also dives into contemporary nationalist iconographies. So at first glance, this print seems to have very little to bear or very little in common with the landscapes that we've already seen by Shamut and Mansour and Ghammam. But the print nevertheless alludes to the same language of maternal bounty that defines Palestine in their canon. So if you look, growth is actually everywhere. Trees spring upwards from bodies, figures give birth, and animals throughout the image nourish themselves with food. So for example, in the foreground with the procession, you see a bird with a worm, you see a horse grazing, of course there's the crow picking in the background. So in some ways, Hallaj's print represents a more sinister dimension in the allegory of Palestine as the virginal mother. So if the potential threat of violation hangs over the purity of Palestine in more traditional allegorical representations, here the threat has very much become the reality. The woman giving birth does so in the shadow of the specter of death, while two men pull her legs apart by their tethers. This act simultaneously evokes sexual violence and restricts her movement, rendering her unable to escape out from underneath the looming skeleton. The animals who reap the benefits of the earth, feeding on worms and grass, are also part of a funeral procession, and the trees shooting skyward do so from the bodies of the dead and the dying. So gone is the harmonious Palestine of nationalist dreams in this image, and is instead replaced by a landscape that has been thrown into chaotic flux by violence. So where Ghanam, Shamut, and Mansour paint unsullied Palestinian women in timeless surroundings, Hallaj emphasizes this idea of contamination, fusing animals and plants and people at both the beginnings and the ends of their life cycles. So Hallaj is presenting us here with this morbid balance of life and death that centers the occupation's impact on the land rather than pushing it away or pushing it to the periphery. A mother faces death so that her baby may be born. Trees are nourished by the dead. The god of war heralds a funeral for a martyr who is also a forest. On one hand, the land itself relies on death to perform its life-giving functions. All victory, growth, or progress comes at a high price. And this could be seen, maybe, as a reflection on the senselessness of dying for territory that remains shackled beneath the control of the occupier. On the other hand, though, the persistence of nature in this violent world points to the resilience of Palestine itself, which regenerates anew despite continued efforts to destroy it. The nightmarish quality of the print suggests something not wholly formed, as if to offer us the raw material of the subconscious instead of a didactic narrative. We are free, as Hallaj famously insisted, to draw our own conclusions from the fruits of his imagination. Samira Badran was born in exile in Libya to a family of prominent Palestinian artists and artisans. Her father was Jamal Badran, renowned for his craftsmanship across a variety of media, including ceramics and woodwork, among many other things. Jamal moved the family back to Palestine when Samira was a young child, and she grew up around her father's studio in Ramallah. After she went to Cairo and finished her higher education there, she returned to Ramallah for a year and taught art to refugees in the UNRWA Women's Training Center there. So during this time, this was a really fruitful time for her artistic practice, and she made a series of mixed media drawings, such as this one, including this one, that were inspired by the environment that she observed in the refugee camps. So this 25 barrels is such a densely crafted work of art that it's honestly hard to know where to begin to look at it. So let's start from the bottom. At the base lays a figure, a seemingly, again, hominid body with an animal skull, which seems to be that of a camel or a horse, wrapped tightly in a bundle of cloth as if wrapped in a funeral shroud. It's immobilized. It's tied to a horizontal structure that resembles a tree trunk or a ship's mast, and it's surrounded by a cage. So from the center of its forehead, a white line snakes up towards the top of the composition, and an alligator sits on the cage above its chest. Surrounding both the creature and the alligator are piles of detritus resembling cast-off construction materials and, of course, barrels, their wooden stomachs distorted, separated from their metal armatures. There's something alive about these barrels, something recalcitrant. Their metal hoops are like human ribs, red circles set into them like reflective, almost cartoonish eyes. Above them, more garbage-like objects, often resembling creatures or parts of them. Bundles of cloth, wood, and scrap metal look vaguely like a hanging bat, a skeletal fishtail, horses' noses, and a giant crab. So these forms grow sparser towards the top of the composition, where a blue background meets white abruptly as if it were a horizon line. So this is an incredibly confusing composition, and part of the reason it's confusing, I think, is because we are immediately hit with this problem of perspective. Read from the bottom up, the way I just have, this work might look like an underwater cross-section, like you're looking at, a pile of things underwater, objects piled on top of each other from the ocean floor going up to the surface. There are key elements in this composition, though, that sort of disrupt this perspective, most notably the white line emanating from the bundled figure's head and a blue Y-shaped line of similar width and brightness. These lines, more than anything else, insist on a cartographical reading of the drawing, imitating rivers as if we're looking at a map or an aerial image of territory. They encourage us to see these piles of materials as the topography of a landscape, their varied colors and textures marking differences in terrain. Neither of these perspectives are commensurate with one another. The caged figure disrupts the coherence of an aerial perspective, while the river-like lines and island-like objects resist the verticality of the composition. So we have two possible vantage points that are wrestling for our attention and, they're perpetually unresolved. We never actually have one perspective on this drawing. So this perspectival instability is disorienting. It exacerbates the visual overwhelm of the many crowded details of this drawing, and it renders it profoundly unsettling. As an underwater scene, the primary impression it gives is one of claustrophobia. The evocation of water alone suggests suffocation. The shrouded figure is bound far from the apparent surface of the water, unable to access air, but the pileup of material around it also adds a dimension of weight and volume, as though it's crushing the figure. As a map, the space feels cluttered and chaotic, almost as though we're looking down on an enormous landfill. Furthermore, and especially interesting in the context of a map, the drawing is brimming with allusions to constraint. Among its most identifiable elements are ropes, chains, and barbed wire, and of course the cage. So these are all things that are intended to restrict motion, to hem people or animals into spaces that they might want to escape. As part of a cartographical iconography, they implicate mapping itself, the very process of delineating territory, as a similar mechanism of brute control. So equating maps with cages, with things that constrain, restrict, etc. So I would argue then that this drawing deals with the realities of the occupation on three primary levels. On a level of basic iconography, there's this tumultuous jumble of broken parts that evokes the literal space of the refugee camp, where overcrowding and underfunding result in the constant breakdown of the built environment. Experientially, in terms of how we see it, it disorients and overwhelms the viewer, who cannot even determine how to look at the image, let alone what to make of it. This sensory response, on some small level, mirrors the sense of whiplash and disbelief that faced Palestinians, especially internally displaced refugees, like Bedran students, as they tried to absorb the reality of their material losses. The feeling of suffocation and claustrophobia this work engenders is, after all, a primary condition of life under occupation. As Israel expropriated more and more property, Palestinians were condensed into smaller and smaller areas. The camps overflowed, and cities like Ramallah swelled while settlements consumed larger and larger swaths of land. Finally, this work insists on the entanglement of mapping, control, and entrapment, reflecting the practical consequences for Palestinians of Israeli territorial control. So, what I've tried to identify in this presentation is just one of many facets of the history of Palestinian landscape images. I've pointed to a moment, at the height of the Palestinian liberation struggle, during which artists seem to be using realist and surreal or fantastic visual vocabularies in complex and interconnected ways. Literal and allegorical landscapes use straightforward, legible iconography to magical ends, conjuring an idealized Palestine rather than mirroring or working through the reality on the ground. The phantasmagorical landscapes of Hallaj and Badran, however, created chaotic, almost hallucinatory scenes of mythical beasts and impossible scenarios that nevertheless engaged with the physical upheaval wrought by the Israeli occupation in ways that more realistic depictions did not. Both of these representational strategies, if you want to call them strategies, played vital roles in Palestinian visual culture within and outside of Palestine during the 1970s, but the latter has not been a major topic of inquiry for scholars of art history. My ultimate contention, therefore, is a simple one. Those of us committed to the study of Palestinian art must think more seriously about fantasy. The aesthetics of magic, mythology, and science fiction have opened up imaginative pathways for artists throughout the 20th century, enabling critical thinking that circumvents the limitations of realism. Paying closer attention to these aesthetics in those pathways, as I've tried to do today, reveals the hidden historical dimensions of alternate artistic realities. Thanks. Oh boy, it is hot. Thank you all for staying through all of that. Does anybody have any questions? Yeah, of course. Such an excellent question. My family was kicked out of there. My grandfather was Palestinian, which is what set the ball rolling on that. But the landscape specifically, I think, is interesting because people tend to simplify it into, like, some of the stuff that I was showing before, this idea that, Palestinian landscapes are just idealized pictures of wheat or dead K or something like that. So, and I noticed these kinds of trends as I was doing more research, and I became interested in how other people were seeing landscapes.
Yeah, and I really like how you incorporated art into it because I'm an art teacher major.
Oh, fantastic. Good job.
And my friend actually did her master's thesis on landscape and urbanism, and she had done it on Palestine. So
it's a very hard, it's a very, very hard place to deal with landscape and urbanism for sure.
Yeah, so she kind of, but it's interesting how you incorporated art into because she has done architecture.
Yeah.
Landscape art, they're very visual.
Yes, and the art tends to, it gives us a degree of separation. We can look at it from a historical perspective and we can enjoy it and analyze it without breaking our hearts constantly.
But like some of the words you use just remind me of their thesis.
Oh, good. Well, yes, I'm glad there are people doing that work. It's very important work to do. Anyone else? Fantastic. Everyone go find some water. Stay hydrated. Of course. Thank you.